Hey everyone, so welcome to another Technicoding programming tutorial. In this video, we will be continuing on with our iOS authentication handling series. In this video in particular, we will be creating the Django backend. We will be setting up the settings and getting it all running out of the box, and then the next video will be adding to that. So without further ado, let's get started. So if I go over to my terminal, what we need to do is a couple things. First off, you need to make sure that you have Python installed on your system in order to do this. So we are using a Django backend, and that means that we need Python installed because Django runs off of Python. If you're running off of Windows, you will probably have to install it. I won't go over that in this video. I might do a video in the future on that, installing it on your PC. But Mac users, you already have Python installed, but it's an older version. I think it's 2.7. So you'll have to go in and actually install that. I personally use Homebrew to install Python packages or Python onto my system. We are using Python. I need to type in Python 3 because I'm actually using Python 3 here. We're using Python 3.11.6. Okay. So the first thing you need to do after you install Python, go into a directory you want to actually house the project. In this case, I'm already there. So what I need to do is I need to make the directory for the project. And then what I need to do is I just need to go inside that project. So I'm going to change the directory into the auth backend. Then I need to create a Python virtual environment. Python 3 m the env. Okay, so a Python virtual environment is basically a sandbox, so we can download all of our dependencies for this project within this environment, and it doesn't pollute into our normal Python packages on the system. So just think of this as a sandbox. It's going to take a second. And then what you'll notice is we have a new directory within this project called env. So real quick, Python 3, make a virtual environment, and then we name the virtual environment right here. In order to download packages to this virtual environment, we have to activate it. We do that by doing source env bin activate. And you know it's activated because we have this little prefix on our terminal line, and its name is the name that we actually named the environment. So anything we install as far as Python packages within this environment will be local to this auth backend env directory. So the next thing we need to do is we need to install our packages. We do that using pip3, which is a Python package manager, and pip3 install Django 4.2. And just wildcard. And well, real quick, we're downloading Django 4.2. It is up to 5 at the time of this video, but all of their long-term support versions are a .2 version. So we're going to say the current long-term support version, and we don't really care what the minor version is, just give us the most recent one. We also need Django REST framework and Django REST framework Simple JWT. Django REST framework is a library to help us make APIs, and Django REST framework Simple JWT is the authentication and token generating library we're going to use for most of our authentication. Tap enter, it's going to install all of it. And then the one thing we want to do as good practice for building Python and Django apps, after we have installed all of our dependencies, we want to make sure that if we give this project to anyone else as far as a developer goes, they can install these packages out of the box and they won't have to deal with manually typing everything we just did. To do that, we can use something called pip3 freeze, the freeze command, and we can save that into a file. And that file, the standard in the industry is to name the file requirements.txt. Tap enter. and listed the contents of the directory, we can see we have a new file. Now, if we quickly cat the requirements file just to list the contents, you can see that it stored our libraries in these individual lines, and then it also states the dependencies on our libraries. So a future developer can take this and do something like pip3 install r for requirements file, and then this. And then if I hit enter, it's going to complain because I already have everything downloaded. But that is how you reinstall or freshly install packages in a virtual environment if you're a different dev adopting a project. Let me clear this out. So the next thing we need to do is we need to start the Django project. We actually have to create the Django project. We can do that because this environment knows that we have Django installed. So to do that, we can use the Django admin start project command. And we're going to say that we're going to name this iOS auth. Basically what it's doing is it's creating a subdirectory for all of the Django project. We don't want that. We want the Django project's root to be in the current directory. So we have to actually specify that the current directory is where everything needs to go. We do that with its // So now if we list the contents, we see we have this new iOS auth directory. This holds the settings for Django and a couple other things. And we have this manage.py file. This is where most of the Django commands will be contained in, and we will actually reference this as a command, as a source of command for the future commands that we have. Anyway, so from here on out, the Django project is created. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to open this in PyCharm and continue there because it's a little bit easier to see everything that's going on. You can open this up in any other IDE you need or any other program. I use PyCharm professionally with other clients. I actually pay for the professional version, and the professional version comes out of the box with Django support. If you already have it, it's going to be really easy for you to follow along. If not, you can still follow along. I'm going to do things in a way where it's not too dependent on the IDE. Okay, so I've set up the project, or I've opened the project in PyCharm, so let me bring that in quick. And the first thing you need to do in PyCharm is actually set the interpreter, basically that environment that we set up earlier. So we need to go to Settings, Python Interpreter. We need to add the interpreter, and it's going to be locally existing, and we need to search for it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this guy up. Auth backend, it's auth, environment bin, Python 3. Okay. And if I hit OK, you'll see that all of the packages that we have installed in this environment are listed within this area right here. We're going to hit apply. Just as a real quick side note, if you go to languages and frameworks, if you have the professional version of PyCharm, you'll see this Django option, and you'll see that PyCharm is intelligent enough to look into that env directory and auto-enable Django support based off of that. So out of the box, PyCharm can be just quickly configured to use that environment. The nice thing is that now that we have that interpreter set, if we click on this terminal button, you can see that the environment is already active within the terminal. So we don't have to go back and forth between the terminal now, unless we want to show like a lot of things or we have a specific need to, I guess. But this is the terminal we will be using from here on out. So with any Django project, the first thing you want to do is you want to open the settings and adjust your settings as needed for third-party libraries, staging production environments, so on and so forth. In a production app, or I should say in a production project, these settings will more than likely be split into different settings themselves inside of a settings directory. You'll have one for production, you'll have one for staging, dev, and then you'll have a base one that's shared between the three of the other ones. For this class, I'm not going to go over that. I'm going to leave it as one settings file. I will set up the settings in a kind of pseudo production way. So first thing we need to do in order to fully kind of set the settings up is we want to switch out any sensitive data to be included as an environment variable. To do that, we need to import the OS library, and then we need to start switching. Okay, so just to show you real quick, if you ever need to set a environment variable, you can do so within the terminal if you need to run the project. So typically when you run a Django project, you would type in manage.py run server, and that would actually like start running the server. But if you want to add that secret key to it, you would actually type that out equals this. Oh, I gotta take out my caps here. And that should add the environment variable to that runtime session. But for the sake of this project, I'm going to make it easier for ourselves so I don't have to type that in every time and use build configurations. So these run configurations. So within these configurations, what you want to do is you want to come down to environment variables, click on this, click on add, type in secret key. And then what we can do is we can type in our secret key, but we don't want to add these quotation marks in there this time around. And then tap OK, apply, and then hit OK. So now if we ran the project, this secret key, it would be able to get this from the environment right here. For development reasons, I highly suggest if you're in development that you set the default value with this as well. It's just going to make things a lot easier just in case a developer forgets to set the secret key. And you can add reasonable defaults to other environment variables as well. Moving down the list, what we have to do next is we have to add a I want to add a server base equals HTTPS 27.0.0.1 port 8000. The reason I'm doing this is just so I can refer to this variable within the code base. This is not setting, it's not telling Django to run off of this port. Django out of the box will already run at this URL. Sorry, this has to be HTTP. So it's HTTP 127.0.0.1 port 8000. So like I said, Django will automatically run at this URL. We're just defining it in a variable so it's more easily acquired. Allowed hosts, we're going to set this as a wildcard right now, but in production, you would set this as your own domain. So it would be HTTP, hopefully S for secure, mydomain.com, or any other trusted domain that will need access to your app. Mobile apps will still be able to access the APIs we'll be creating here, even if this wildcard is set to the domain. But just for development reasons, we're going to keep this as a wildcard because we're using localhost, and it's an easy way to get around this during development. So the next thing we need to do is we need to add a couple apps. So Django is set up so each has apps inside of it, and think of those as like packages, right? So if you're familiar with iOS, those would be the same as like Swift packages. Django's are a little bit more flexible though, and they're really only like self-contained places to add code. Each app will have its own like URLs routing. It will have its own like APIs. It can store its own models, but Django doesn't really limit you to keep it in that kind of way. You can kind of set up the project any way you want. But what we need to do is we need to add a new app to this. That's gonna be done by typing out manage.py start app API. The app can be named anything. In a production app, I would probably split this up between auth and API. But this is kind of up to the developer on how they want to organize the project. So now that that's done, we need to do two things. We need to add our apps, including the third-party apps, to the list of installed apps so Django knows that they're there. And then we also have to run migrations. So the first thing we want to do is add these apps. So we're going to say api.apps.api-config. Then we're going to import the REST framework used for creating APIs. Then we're also going to import the REST framework Simple JWT library. And then we're also going to import a library within the Simple JWT library called Token Blacklist. Just a real quick overview of this. We are using Simple JWT to send out JWT tokens. Those are stateless, which means those aren't saved in the database. Within each of those tokens, there is user information such as the username and password. It's safer to send those around using a JWT because they're encrypted, and that encryption is stored within this project. So we don't really have to worry too much about the security on that. And because these JWTs do have an expiration, if someone gets a hold of them, it's a little bit more secure because they do expire. However, because they're stateless, there's no reference in the database, which means we can't revoke them. So Simple JWT has this token blacklist app that has a couple models that we can create to blacklist these stateless JWTs. Basically, what'll happen is, using this, we can revoke these JWTs by putting them in a blacklist. So whenever the user tries to use one, the app will then say, hey, is this in the blacklist? And if it is, we're going to reject it. So moving on, you don't have to know too much about the middleware right now. Take a look at the Django docs for more information on that. We can skip over a couple of these other things too, such as the database. We're just using SQLite for this. The auth password validators, if you want to have more strict password validation, such as if you require a certain format for passwords, you can create your own validator and add it to these. Django comes out of the box with a couple of these, so it's pretty secure out of the box. So you don't have to actually worry about that. Some of these other settings I won't go over right now. This just has to do with localization and time zones. And coming down to the static URL, we really aren't going to be using any statics in this, so I'll leave this blank for right now. And what we need to do, though, is we need to add our email configuration. So we need to type in email backend equals, I'm going to paste this in here so I don't mistype anything. We need to say email use Rob, you type today, TLS equals true. So these settings are highly dependent on what email provider you use. So it's either going to be TLS or SSL. For this one, we use TLS because I'm using Gmail. I'm also going to say email host equals os.getenv email host. Done. And I'm going to type in a couple other of these. I'm going to paste a couple of these in here as well. Save some time. You can pause the video and type these in as needed. But basically what we're doing is we are setting this project up where all of these email settings are going to be imported using environment variables. So this is how a production level app would be set up. The other thing we have to add in here are the settings for our two libraries that we used. So what we need to do is we're going to type in, or I'll paste in, the REST framework settings. So if you want to take a look at more of these options, look at the Django REST framework documentation. It lists out each of these keys and what the values can be. The one you want to look at, though, is this one right here. So these other ones are pretty good defaults. Basically, just as a quick overview, we have the REST framework renderers, JSON renderer, and then this basically tells the Django REST framework to return responses as JSON. We've got the default permission classes, which defaults to is authenticated. So whenever we create a endpoint that is created using Django REST framework, it's going to default to saying that the user has to be authenticated in order to use that endpoint. Now, this one, the default authentication classes, this is where it gets interesting. So we could create our own authentication class and then tell the Django REST framework that, hey, whenever a user hits an endpoint, this is the class that's going to ingest the request information and make sure that they are authenticated before we're going to allow them to proceed with hitting the rest of the endpoint. Now, because we have imported the Simple JWT library, all we have to do is use the one that's out of the box with that library, and that's what we're doing here. So then I'll come back up and I'll explain the rest of this email stuff here in a second, because I'll have to set those environment variables. But right before that, we want to set the Simple JWT library settings up, and we do that by adding a variable called Simple JWT as a dictionary. Now, these settings again are inside the Simple JWT documentation. So if you need to see what other options are in here, go to the documentation for this library and they'll be all listed. Now it's complaining to me right here because I don't actually have the time delta imported. So I'm going to do from datetime import time delta. If I scroll all the way back down, we'll see that these are cleared up. Now, real quick, the access token lifetime, how many days before the access token expires. The refresh token lifetime should be a little bit more than the access token lifetime. So if you want a user to have a perpetual login within the app, what you would do is typically you would either look to see if the account access token is expired, or you actually make a request and you get a access denied response from the server. And then in both those situations, you would use a refresh token to fetch a new JWT that includes a new access and refresh token. So because of that, you want to allow enough time for the user to have the access token expire or hit an endpoint and get that access denied response before the refresh token expires. So if a user doesn't actually use your app within the 5 days after that this access token is expired, then they'll have to log in again, basically. So on a case per case basis, you're gonna, as a developer, you're gonna ask the stakeholders how long they actually want this to be. It's a security balance on how long you want this to be, but that's a personal decision, really. But anyway, so this rotate refresh tokens is basically saying once I use a refresh token, it's going to return a new one, rather than relying on us to reuse the same one. And then it's going to say if we use a refresh token and it sends us a new one, automatically blacklist the old one, and we're setting that to true because we only want to use those refresh tokens once. Now coming back up to these email settings, just a quick note. So this email host is going to be something like smtp.gmail.com, something like smtp.gmail.com. These settings are going to be within your email provider. They're different for each email provider, so you're going to have to take a look at these. The email port is sometimes 465. It's sometimes, a handful of other things. The email user is the actual email at example.com. It's your actual email account that you're going to use with the password to authenticate sending out emails, and then the password is the password. Now, again, these will be inside your hosting provider. Now, I'm going to take a second to add these to my environment variables, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I've added those to my configuration. So the next thing we need to do is we actually need to make sure that our third-party libraries have added their models to the database, and we actually have to create the database. So what we need to do is we need to come back into our terminal here, and we need to type in /manage.py, make migrations. Now, this isn't actually going to do anything, but it's good practice to run this before you actually run migrations. What this does is it checks the Django app to see if any new models or any model changes have occurred, and then it will actually create the Django code that will run SQL behind the scenes to apply those changes on the database. So if we hit enter, no changes detected as we thought. Then you do manage.py migrate. Now, we have to do this because we included all of those packages, the Blacklist, the REST framework, and Simple JWT. We included new apps into our list of installed apps, and a lot of these third-party packages will have their own database models included in them. So we have to make sure with that when we create the database, and we also apply the models from those packages to the database. So anytime you add a new app, you want to really run migrate. So what you're going to notice is up here we have a new db.sqlite 3. Now the cool thing is about Django is I can actually add that database as a data source here, and I can see the entire database within the IDE. So what we're going to do is we're going to say we're going to add this to test it out. It's on there and it's connected. So we now have the database listed right here, right? So you can actually double click on any of these and it will list the actual contents of that table within the editor. And this is a really quick way to just see what's in the database to list out. You can even list out the columns from right here. You can even do like database diagrams. But since most people probably won't have PyCharm, we're going to actually look at the database in another way. And that is using the Django admin site. So real quick, all we have to do is now that we have all of these migrations applied, we've set up the entire project, we can actually run it now. So what we can do now is I'm going to run the project. And if I click on this link right here, it's going to open a window and it's going to say that everything's all set. We're good to go. So Django is nice because out of the box, if you just set everything up and then run it, you can hit the link and then it just gives you this nice little area. So you can actually go to the documentation. You can start a tutorial with this, or you can go to the Django community. Yeah, so it's pretty nice. Okay, so now that we have the project all set up, we can go into what is called the admin site. So back here into the link we just opened, what we're going to do is we're going to add at the end of it admin. So Django is really nice because Django comes out of the box with this admin site, and you can use this to manage any of the IT as far as the database goes. So you can add objects, remove objects, update objects in the database, and you can configure it pretty much to your heart's content. Now, in order to actually log in, we need a super user. So if I go back into PyCharm and I go into the terminal, I need to create a new user. Let me clear this out. To do that, I have to type in manage.py, create super user. And then it's going to ask me what I want the username to be. I'm going to type in webmaster, and I'm going to give it a password. Oh, sorry, I'm going to give it an email, which is, I'm just going to say admin@example.com for now. Then I'm going to give it a password. And then we're good. So now what we can do is we can go back into that admin site, and then we can type in webmaster. Typed in the password wrong. Tester 1 2 3. And then we're in. So now that we're in, you can see that they have a couple different tables here. Now the token blacklist is actually coming from the third-party package for the blacklisted models. But we can see we have users here. If you click on users, there's our webmaster right here. So we can use this to visualize what the database contains as we move forward. So if you are using PyCharm, you can use that nice database area that you have here. But if not, you can use the admin site. And that concludes the first video. I'll catch you in the next one.